advise you to put on some good headphones or listen to this episode in a quiet environment, so you can really identify the problems we're talking about. If you can't hear this, you probably won't hear most of what this episode is about. Welcome to the Audio Laboratory. In the past episodes, we've learned how to record a voiceover at home. But that is not the end of the story. A good voiceover recording is a mere raw ingredient in the dish we want to serve to our viewers. If that dish is not prepared correctly, people will notice. Before our voiceover leaves the kitchen, there are a few things we need to do first. As is so often the case, raw materials have to be worked on before they reach the final form we've come to appreciate. Quite a bit of effort is needed to turn them into a finished product. The recording undergoes a process of refinement, where we cut away the bits and pieces that are unnecessary, and we take the utmost care to ensure that everything fits together nicely. And in the end, when the final product is presented, it has become more than the sum of its parts. Let's take a look at all this in the digital audio workstation. After we drag in our recording, we're faced with the entire unedited recording session. This, of course, contains a lot of garbage, bad takes, traffic noises, and so on. We're now going to manually edit all this with just the 3 standard tools in our DAW, in this case Reaper, but the procedure will be very similar in other DAWs. The only effects we have on this track are an EQ for clarity and a compressor that evens out the dynamics a bit. We leave them both on while editing, so it's easier for you to hear the cuts and problems. An unusual thing you might have noticed on the waveform is that there are all these spikes. Do you remember that at the end of the second voiceover recording episode we told you to get one of these training clickers from the pet shop? Well, I use that clicker every time I think I just recorded a good take. It's like an acoustic marking. These clicks are very easy to spot on the waveform, and now I can use them as a reference when editing, to go looking for the best bits. Let me show you a few useful commands when editing dialogue. First, make sure the grid is turned off. We don't want to be restricted by any measures or beats. We want to be able to position the playhead freely. By pressing S, you can split a media item. This cuts it in 2 at the current position of the playhead. With the delete key, you can delete an item. You could also make a time selection and press Shift and S. This will split the item at the borders of the time selection. By dragging the sides, you can trim an item. Remember that everything we do here is non-destructive. We never actually modify the original recording with our edits. The file is just referenced in this project, so of course we can also extend the item again after trimming it. That's really all you need to make a rough cut of your voiceover. Choose the best takes, cut away the parts you don't need, and bring everything into the right order. A feature that makes this process a lot more comfortable is called ripple editing. Normally deleting something will leave a gap, but with ripple editing active, deleting an item won't leave a gap. Instead, all following items will move up or ripple along the timeline. This allows you to quickly cut away unwanted parts while still maintaining a coherent timeline. But ripple isn't limited to just deleting. If you move an item while ripple is active, this will make all following items move along with it. And you can even choose whether only the current track should ripple or if all tracks should be affected. By the way, you can move any alternatives to a muted track, like a reserve bench or a parking lot. This gives you more choices later on. Okay, after assembling this rough cut, now it's time to take care of the fine details. When you make a cut, Reaper adds very small fades on both sides of the cut, which is good. That way you don't get those nasty pops when you cut into the wrong part of the waveform. You can edit the duration of these fades, make them shorter, longer, or remove them altogether. In general, the fade-in can be kept very short, since most words have a very clearly defined beginning. You can place your cuts right before them. With softer sounds like the H in hello, you have to be a bit more careful not to cut off anything important. The ends and fade-outs, on the other hand, usually have to be a bit longer to sound natural. Cut too close to the end, and it sounds weird, but they're not exactly the same. Leave too much room, and you'll notice the background noises again. But they're not exactly the same. Try to find a balance between the two, and after a bit of practice, you'll soon get a feeling for the right timing. But they're not exactly the same. And this gives us all the tools we need to trim away the excess and remove those in-between noises and pauses. Very much like the two oscillators Very much like the two oscillators from our experiment before, these two guitar recordings are very similar to another, but they're not exactly the same. Similar to another, but they're not exactly the same. After a bit of work, we went from here, very much like the two oscillators from our experiment before, these two guitar recordings are very similar to another, but they're not exactly the same. To here. Very much like the two oscillators from our experiment before, these two guitar recordings are very similar to another, but they're not exactly the same. A much more professional sounding result. And it's really surprising that you can't hear that passing car anymore. It's clearly there, but they're not exactly the same. But if you remove the noise around the dialogue, the brain is tricked into ignoring it because there's no trace of the car in between the words. Similar to another, but they're not exactly the same. Of course, that doesn't work every time, but here it worked pretty well. Sometimes you can even Frankenstein a usable take out of a few smaller fragments. Several smaller pieces. The Amen break is now split into several smaller pieces, and each of these is assigned to a note on the sequencer. Fading away unwanted parts or cutting dialogue into pieces works really well if your recording is very clean, meaning it doesn't have too much noise, ambience or room tone. Since I'm using a very low noise microphone inside of a quiet room with acoustic absorbers, this isn't really a problem, but we'll show you how to deal with noisier recordings in a future episode. Regarding breathing noises, of course it's your decision whether you want to remove any in-between breathing or not. If you feel the breathing is a vital part of the performance, then by all means leave it in. You could also just reduce the breathing noises by dipping down the volume on an automation envelope. A feature that I always find useful is seamless pattern copy. This means you can create a copy of the current pattern and switch to that copy without interrupting playback. If you want to know more about that, take a look at our episode about automation. If a part of your performance was a little too loud, you can use automation to dial back the volume. Today we're going to take a look at every Eurodance song ever. And if you got quieter towards the end of a sentence, automation can make up for that as well. And that's what I'm missing from the Electron machines. With these techniques, you can also get rid of any noises between words, lip smacks and mouth clicks for example. If these happen in between words, that's no problem, but more often than not, they will happen while you're speaking. Just drag the source track's routing box onto the plugin interface. You can't remove these just by reducing the volume, or else you'll punch a hole into your dialogue. Plugin interface. Instead, you can use a technique called spectral editing. Let's switch this item into spectrogram view. This shows the energy in different frequency bands across time. The bass frequencies are down here and the treble frequencies up there. And you can now actually see that mouth click in the spectral view. Right there. Onto the plug. Let's add a spectral edit. Now we get this window, which we can position and adjust to cover the problem area. With these dials, you can adjust the compression threshold and ratio until the mouth click is gone. Onto the plug. onto the plugin interface. Sometimes this takes a bit of trial and error. If necessary, you can also fade the borders of the window to make the edit a little bit more smooth. Onto the plugin interface. Just drag the source track's routing box onto the plugin interface. You can also quickly DS, or in this case, DF your dialog. But not necessarily in a bad way, more like a fine cheese, I guess. A fine cheese, I guess. More like 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 a fine cheese, I guess. As a final step, make sure to critically listen to your finished voiceover and check it for timing, fluency, and intonation. We've now looked at how to manually clean up a good voiceover with just the basic tools found in practically every DAW. But what if the recording conditions were less than ideal, or you don't have that much time for post-production? There are ways to make your life easier and even automate some of the work. That's what the next episodes will be about, so stay tuned. Don't hesitate to leave a comment, and if you want to see more videos like this one, subscribe and ring the bell.
Bunny.